From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and ahead today from Oklahoma State University, Derrell Peel. On this week's Cattle Market segment, he'll talk about his recent month-long trip to China and what he learned about the cattle production sector there, as well as the demand for U.S. beef in China. Then segments from the latest BCI Cattle Chat podcast from the Beef Cattle Institute here at K-State. Brad White, Bob Larson, and Bob Weaber. We'll discuss, among other things, the prospect of grazing cattle on drought-stressed alfalfa and controlling the bloat issue there. And Jeff Wickman has this week's 4-H segment. He'll talk with K-State's Deryl Waldren about the upcoming Kansas 4-H Wheat Expo. All that and more right here on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Welcome to Agriculture Today from the campus of Kansas State University, and good to have you tuned in once again. Well, for our cattle market segment, we'll have something a little out of the ordinary because our guest now has just returned from a 1-month trip to the People's Republic of China on behalf of Oklahoma State University, where he serves as a livestock economist. Derrell Peel, timely in that he did travel to that country given the trade issues that have welled up, and we'll get into that as well. Derrell, though, talk about this trip. You actually spent 28 days in China. What was the orientation of this?
Well, there were several dimensions to my travel in China. The first half of it, about 2 weeks, I was in Beijing teaching at China Agricultural University. Oklahoma State University has a agribusiness program joint with them, and we get a number of students, juniors and seniors, that come here to finish their agribusiness degrees at Oklahoma State. But we also send some faculty over occasionally to teach classes on campus there. So that was the first 2 weeks of my trip. Then it sort of morphed into more of an industry orientation and some travel to see quite a bit of the country, and also to try to learn a little bit about cattle and beef markets and the potential, certainly from a U.S. export perspective.
Let's spend some time on what you observed during that latter 2 weeks in particular, and the things that you picked up about the Chinese agricultural sector and Chinese interest in U.S. agricultural products for that matter. What were some standout things that caught your attention there, Derrell?
Well, again, we traveled by train in a fairly large loop through central China or around central China. Gave us an opportunity to see a lot of different country. We traveled by a very impressive bullet train, I might add, and so you're traveling at fairly high speeds, but still get to see a lot of country. We observed a lot of crop production, some of which you could identify: wheat production, rice production, corn production. We did observe wheat harvest in progress in some areas, and again, just a good view of crop production. You know, my interest in the livestock industry, and specifically in the beef industry, included opportunities to visit with some industry people about beef production in China. But one of the notable things about all of that travel that we did by train was you really observe very little livestock production, even though we travel through some of the regions where a significant part of domestic Chinese beef production takes place. So
they have a viable beef industry, but as per scale of that industry, it's not terribly big, it sounds.
Well, that's right, and it does vary regionally. There are some areas, if you get farther north and west in China into the Inner Mongolia area. I didn't get to visit there this trip, but there's some larger open grasslands kinds of areas where you would see some bigger herds of cattle. In the central part of the country, which again is in total accounts for a significant part of their total beef production, is very, very small-scale operations, both crop and livestock. You know, these are small producers who have just a handful of cattle in most cases, and so you just didn't see big herds of cattle. In something like 3,500 miles of travel by train, I probably didn't see 24 head of cows out and about, and yet I know there's some there. They're just not real obvious.
Well, despite the fact that they may not have great volume, is their cattle industry relatively modern or something else?
Well, it's based on, native breeds that they generally describe as yellow cattle. It actually is some variation within that. They operate in a wide variety of climates, ranging from coastal plain areas up into the mountains. They did talk about, in terms of some of the visits I had, talked about efforts to crossbreed with European breeds, developing more productivity in those operations. Obviously, the small scale is one of the limiting factors, and they did talk about the fact that while there is a lot of potential for increased beef production in the country, it probably implies moving to larger scale operations in many cases.
What about that potential? China expands in so many sectors of its economy year by year. Is there a chance that the beef sector there could truly take off at some point?
Well, I think it will happen over time. Certainly you've seen it in the pork industry with hogs, in the dairy sector. In fact, I've been asked about foreign investment, and you've seen that in those two sectors, not so much in the beef industry, I don't think. At least that's my impression. And again, kind of as it is in other places, it's probably a little bit slower to develop given the sort of dispersed nature and the extensive nature of cattle production. But I do think over time you will continue to see, both crop and livestock production continue to modernize more and more with a little bit less labor intensity and a little more scale and mechanization involved in those production systems.
Deryl, during your time there, either on that train trip or back in Beijing earlier, were you able to get any sort of read on the Chinese appetite for U.S. beef?
I did. I reached out to both the Beijing and Shanghai offices of the U.S. Meat Export Federation. I met with staff from both of those folks, and they put me in contact with some additional folks. There clearly is lots of potential in a broad, absolute sense for meat and beef, and of course China has expanded their beef imports dramatically in the last 4 or 5 years. U.S. beef faces a number of challenges that are going to take some time, I think, to overcome. One is that beef is expensive in China. U.S. beef is particularly expensive. And when we think of quality in terms of U.S. beef, of course, quality gets defined different ways in different parts of the world. But the way that beef is consumed, the style of cooking, the nature of the products that are used, I think U.S. beef fits into a fairly narrow market segment now of sort of hotel, restaurant, trade oriented towards Western-style steakhouses, if you will, using cuts of meat. And that market's there, and it has lots of potential to grow to some extent. But then to get into the broader, much broader-based market is going to be a different story, where you're cooking thin cuts of meat in hot pots and those kind of things. U.S.-style beef doesn't add any particular quality attributes to that, and so then price becomes a real challenge when you have to compare it to other sources of beef.
And now doubling down on that, and this is somewhat ironic, as you and your entourage returned from China this past week. Last Friday, those tariffs on Chinese imports into the U.S. went into effect, and then the retaliatory measures expected by China would target several agricultural products, including, as been stated, beef. So that's a shot across the bow that may truly hinder our ability to sell beef into that country, would it not, Deryl?
Absolutely. And again, one of the points that came home most clearly when I met with folks in Shanghai in particular, which is kind of where most of the beef is coming in, and it's a very big international center, so there's a lot of opportunity for this sort of upscale hotel restaurant type business that beef fits into, at least initially. And yet it was very clear that price is an issue, even in those higher income kinds of markets that are there. Now, beef is going to be even more expensive going into China from the U.S. We watched the data for the last several months, and our exports to China have been very small, less than 1% of our total exports in any given month. And the strong message here is that it's going to be a slow process. It's going to take time to develop that market. I think we have challenges on that side in terms of price and sort of use and appropriateness or preference for the product on that end. We also have challenges in the U.S. in terms of the amount of beef that actually qualifies, given the restrictions that are in place for U.S. beef to go to China with or without a tariff.
The tariff situation notwithstanding, though, it would seem that that market is still very much well worth pursuing and finding ways to overcome those hurdles.
Oh, absolutely. I think, as a long-term prospect, it's one that you have to be pretty excited about. And again, it comes back to something that I mention to a lot of audiences when I talk to producers, and that's what I call the law of Chinese markets. And that is, even though that per capita consumption of beef is very small in China, any number times 1.4 billion is a big number. and so beef consumption in total in China is a big number. And so and a small change in that, a small increase in percentage terms is a lot of beef. And so China is now our roughly number 12 export market, but just a little bit of growth in that market could move it up dramatically as a major market and a major destination for U.S. beef exports.
Well, it had to be an enlightening experience for you and your group traveling that country, seeing what Chinese agriculture is all about. Before we let you go, just a quick nod to the markets. We did see futures bounce back nicely last Friday. The cash Fed trade somewhat ill-defined, but where are we at generally?
Well, I think if you look kind of on an annual or seasonal basis, we're at the seasonal peaks in slaughter. So there's always supply challenges this time of the year, and it's made a little bit more exaggerated this year by the fact that we kind of piled up placements of cattle back in the late fall and early winter with dry conditions. Those cattle are coming out now. So we do have that supply pressure, and that's weighing on the market, certainly has weighed on fed cattle prices a little bit. We're at mid-June now. We've probably got our July 4th meat purchases in place from a demand standpoint. So from here forward, we're liable to see a little bit more of the sort of summer doldrums here as we go through the heat of the summer. And for beef markets, that time period from after 4th of July until we get, into August at least and start looking at Labor Day buying is kind of a challenging time. So I think we'll see a little more seasonal weakness in these markets as we go forward. The good side is that we may have sort of moved these supplies forward, and as we work our way through them now, then there's maybe light at the end of the tunnel as we move towards the end of the third quarter and into the fourth quarter of the year.
Very well. Good to have you back in the States. Deryl, thanks for the recap of your trip to China, and we will visit again in a few weeks. Appreciate your time.
You bet. Anytime.
That's Derrell Peel. He is a livestock economist, Oklahoma State University. A bulk of our time today on the cattle market segment reflecting on the trip that he and his group from Oklahoma State took to the People's Republic of China this past month. We'll be back with more on this Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Agriculture Today returns now, and for you here, another offering from the Beef Cattle Institute here at Kansas State University. The team of researchers there get together each week to present the BCI Cattle Chat podcast. They're good enough to let us lift excerpts from that conversation, which features this week K-State veterinarians Brad White and Bob Larson and cow-calf specialist Bob Weaver. Here's Brad.
As we get into summer, one of the questions and one of the things that we've had several conversations about is fly control. Bob, you want to talk a little bit about, and maybe before we even get into control, what kind of flies are you concerned about?
Well, there are a number of flies that really cause problems to cattle as well as cattle producers. Horn flies is probably the one we talk about the most. Horn flies are the flies that kind of just swarm right around the cattle. You can get very high numbers of horn flies on cattle. Their name is
1,000 per side.
Yeah. Their name is not particularly good because they don't stay around the horn or the pole.
Where do they stay?
Shoulders and back.
Okay.
And they take blood meals, so they're annoying. They have biting mouth parts, so that the cattle are annoyed. And that we really think that there's a combination of what causes decreased performance is the annoyance, so the cattle aren't grazing as well, but also just the blood meals, and they're just constant.
But those are the ones when you look at calves or cows, those are the ones on their sides and relatively small.
Yeah, they're little bitty flies, but there's a lot of them. The other fly we talk a lot about is face flies. Usually there's fewer face flies on an animal, and they tend to hang around the face. But they oftentimes spend a lot of their time away from the cattle, which also raises one of the reasons they're maybe a little bit harder to control than some other types of flies.
But the face fly looks like housefly?
It's about that size, and it's going to be around the eyes and face. And our main concern with face flies is the fact that it's one of the things that contributes to and can spread pink eye.
And so you said on horn flies, you said many hundred to Bob, and you said 1,000. How many should I start worrying about it? Because they'll always have a few flies.
Yes, and I wouldn't want to be the researcher that discovered this, but basically what I've always read is 200 to 300 on a side is kind of the number that you need to start doing some intervention. When you get more than that, the cattle are starting to be negatively affected. Less than that, the cattle are pretty tough. They can handle that amount. And so that's one of the reasons why, very first thing in the spring, early in the fly season, is probably not the time to start fly control until the numbers really get up a little bit higher, and then you need to institute some fly control.
Well, unless you're using one of the feed-through products, which then you got to start.
If you want to start that early. So some of the methods that we have to control flies are our chemical methods, basically either pyrethrins or organophosphate classes of chemicals. And a lot of times we'll deliver that with either a dust bag, an oil back rubber type of a device, or fly tags. The other chemical that we do talk about is what Dr. Weber was talking about, is a feed-through larvicide. So it's something you put in the mineral or feed that then the horn fly and the face fly lay their eggs in fresh manure pats. And so the insecticide actually ends up in the manure pat, and that's what controls it. So, and if you're using those feed-through or insect growth regulator type products, those need to be started early in the season. And
people refer to those insect growth regulator IGR. It's common terminology. People talk about feeding IGRs to the cattle.
Yes,
and those are effective. Bob, you've used some of those?
Yeah, we've used some at the second season. We've used two different products, but had really good luck on face fly and horn fly control. When we weren't doing it, you'd get a noticeable accumulation of flies on the cattle. Now, stable fly control has been a challenge for us, so we're taking some alternative actions on that front.
The IGRs aren't going to work very well for stable flies.
It's on the label though, but it doesn't work very good.
They don't lay their eggs quite in the same place. So. Yeah. And in my experience with the IGRs, they work really well for some situations, not as well in others, kind of depending on how many other cattle are within flying distance and those types of things. So
how far can a fly?
How much wood can a woodchuck chuck?
I don't know, but far enough that basically, if neighboring cattle aren't on an insect growth regulator, I'm not going to see as much benefit on my operation.
That's right. Because they'll cross over. Certainly fence line contact and even quarter mile, half mile. Yeah. I mean, they can go a little ways if they know there's going to be a meal. But you talked about the life and where they live. So when we talked about maybe 200 to 300 horn flies, that's where we'd have intervention or concerns. Face flies, you said many fewer. 10, 15, 20 face flies is a lot.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So
if you see those there. But you won't see them. The horn flies spend most of their time on the cattle. What about face flies?
Face flies actually spend most of their time off of the cattle, and only a relatively small amount of their time on the cattle, which is also one of the reasons why some of our controls don't work as well for face flies, because if we're using tags or dusters or oilers, the horn flies are going to be in contact with that chemical and hopefully die.
And they're taking blood meals.
They're taking blood meals, so they're going to die. Yeah. Those face flies, they'll come into contact with those chemicals, but then they fly away and they don't spend that much time around them, so they're not as easy to kill.
Yeah. And you mentioned the different methods, so we can use fly tags, dusters, back rubs. You can put a pour on. And you said maybe you don't want to start that early in the season except the IGRs, and then we talked about IGRs, but when do you want to start fly control? Does it depend on your application method? How do you decide that?
Well, it does kind of depend on your application method, because technically what we'd like to do is wait until there's about 200 flies on it per side, which might be about now, to start your fly control. For many ranchers, we've already kind of handled the cattle, and so we may have already put in ear tags earlier than that, which maybe isn't ideal for fly control, but it's when we handle the cattle. In contrast, though, if you were going to wait and do some branding time, processing of calves and those kinds of things in a few weeks, that might be a good time to start the fly control.
Excellent.
Because we usually get, 70 to 90 days sort of effective coverage on fly tags, and you want to have the back end of that still kind of August, September, which is typically the big, at least around here, seems to be the biggest fly load challenge. And
then there's different chemical types, and the chemical types, you want to have some sort of rotation. So back to having a plan rather than waiting till I see flies and say, well, I'm going to put something out there and then changing my plan in a month or two. So have a season plan and have a multi-year plan would be one of our take-homes.
Yeah, we don't have a livestock entomologist here, so we lean a lot on Justin Talley at Oklahoma State. And Justin does an annual report on fly tag trials and sort of has some really good advice on which products to use, when to use them, what to expect in terms of control, that sort of thing.
We wanted to address today, we got a question on bloat. Bob, you want to describe kind of the question?
Sure. With sort of the drought sort of conditions around parts of Kansas, one of the questions I've recently got is, well, we've got a little bit of alfalfa. We're sort of debating between, do we try to continue to put that up because it's going to have limited productivity from potentially a hay standpoint? Are we better off grazing it? So, and we probably won't get into the economics of that today, but one of the big concerns, of course, if you're going to turn out on alfalfa or other clover legume type products is bloat. So we got to kind of think through that process of how do we introduce animals to a high legume diet, particularly fresh legumes, to prevent bloat. So,
yeah, well, bloat is definitely a disease that will kill some cattle if you're not careful.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the concerns, and you mentioned high legumes. So alfalfa, one example, clover is another.
Yep.
You'll see pastures. So one of the things we try to do is have where it may not be the sole source of their diet, and not turning them out on there when they're really ready to just go after it and eat just that. The other thing you can do, there's some control mechanisms. We can put out some blocks. We'll see that individual animals will have different either susceptibility or they're preferentially eating that a little bit different. So keeping an eye on them, getting them off there. But one of the big things, if possible, is some sort of dilution so that they're not just eating that legumes. And then once they make an adjustment, they tend to do a little bit better with it.
And sort of one of the introduction strategies, a little like kind of higher nitrate grazed forages, don't turn them out really hungry, right? Yeah. So put them on, if you can, free choice, prairie hay or brome hay. Get them filled up with something so when you turn them out, they eat a little bit of clover the first day or two. And I've heard some good strategies of, we'll turn them out for half the day, fill them up 2 days on hay, turn them out for half a day the first day, pen them back up, let them eat hay, fill up again on hay, then the next day turn them out all day, and then the third day they're kicked out. Yeah. So.
Well, these legumes, alfalfa and clover, are excellent grazing, but they do take some additional management compared to grasses.
So the bloat blocks, right, are a potential helpful aid, and they're a surfactant, right? So they keep the bubbles from forming to make frothy bloat, and bloat treatment often is some kind of surfactant treatment as well. So,
and I think the biggest thing with those, they are an effective, as you described, an effective aid. They're not the sole solution. So we can't just put out a bloat block and say, hey, yeah, everything's good, we're ready to go. Still adjusting them in and using that as a part of the plan, I think is great.
Yeah, it's an integrated approach. And kind of like the IGR treatment and the fly stuff, you got to have consumption or it doesn't work. So,
that's exactly right. They all have to eat it.
They all have to eat some. So.
Excellent. Well, one of the other things that I wanted to mention, we just talked about a question. If you have a question or comment, if you want to contact us at bci@ksu.edu, we'd be excited to hear from you, and we're happy to have you listen to us, and we'll join you again next week.
Brad White, Bob Larson, and Bob Weaber of the Beef Cattle Institute at Kansas State University, here on this Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today, and welcome back. Eric Atkinson here. Today's agricultural news headlines for you now, these courtesy in part of DTN. Well, leaders from the American Soybean Association could only respond in dismay on Friday after President Trump announced he was going ahead with $34 billion in tariffs against Chinese technology products because China wasted little time imposing a 25% tariff on U.S. soybeans and other agricultural products. China's Ministry of Commerce officials announced early Saturday that China would impose 25% tariffs on $34 billion in products on July the 6th on a range of products, including soybeans, also products such as pork and chicken, as well as a list of non-agricultural products. Soybeans alone accounting for about roughly $14 billion in export value to China. The White House had stated Friday that the U.S. would pursue additional tariffs if China retaliates, such as imposing new tariffs on U.S. goods, services, or agricultural products. Now, USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue held a press call late Friday, largely to talk about his trip to Canada, but he also got multiple questions about how the USDA would respond to the Chinese tariffs and whether he was ready to tap into as much as $15 billion in Commodity Credit Corporation funds to help producers. Perdue said it was important to see how the price situation plays out for producers rather than looking at daily market fluctuations. Here's more from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
In Washington Friday,
we're putting tariffs on $50 billion worth of technology and other things because we have to, because we've been treated very unfairly.
President Trump announcing tariffs on Chinese goods coming into the U.S., China now vowing to match those on U.S. goods, including agricultural products. Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue, talking to reporters Friday, said there is a process underway that could help soften the blow to U.S. producers. The first step in that process.
We've got to look at the market impact. We're tracking this to look and see what market damage there is from the trade disruptions, and we'll make a calculation and determination in conjunction with the White House and Congress over what direction we can take.
Once again, Perdue said, as he has over the last few months, he does not want to reveal just what kind of help is being planned to help producers. He said first, experts have to figure out what kind of tariffs China will impose.
And we'll have to see from a retaliatory perspective how that plays out.
In Washington, Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Now, the American Soybean Association used words such as distraught and devastating to express that group's frustration after the group twice sought meetings with the president to highlight ways that boosting soybean exports to China could be part of a trade solution rather than resorting to tariffs. Instead, the group noted a new anxiety for soybean growers. And the president and CEO of the U.S. Grains Council, Tom Slate, noted that China and the U.S. have been doing this since at least 2010, the back and forth. The U.S. has been hit with trade actions by China against sorghum, ethanol, corn, and dried distillers' grains, but Slate added he's concerned that the tariffs will continue to open markets to other competitors at the expense of U.S. farmers. And the Association of Equipment Manufacturers said the tariffs jeopardize the industry because China constructs different types of construction and agricultural equipment. The tariffs affect U.S. companies importing equipment that's added to U.S. machinery. By the way, Ohio State University released a report last week stating that producers in that state could lose more than half of his or her annual net income due to the Chinese tariffs. Meantime, despite the controversy over U.S. dairy trade with Canada, Secretary Perdue and Canada's Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food, Lawrence MacAulay, both stressed on Friday that any trade conflicts right now will not do long-term harm to generations of trade and trust between Canada and the U.S. That visit comes as Canada prepares to place 10 to 25% tariffs on more than $16 billion in U.S. products on July the 1st in retaliation for tariffs placed on Canadian steel and aluminum. MacAulay said the relationship between Canada and the U.S. runs deep, in his words, a relationship, he went on to say, built on a generation of trade, trust, and goals. The agricultural leaders also assured producers on both sides of the border they were not dismantling Canada's dairy supply management system. Next up on Agriculture Today, this week's edition of Tree Tales. And awaiting with that, K-State forester Bob Atchison. Bob?
As we transition from spring to summer, trees put on tremendous growth. Unfortunately, so does the herbaceous vegetation that often competes for water and nutrients. For tree planting success, it is important to consider how to control weeds and grass that will compete for valuable moisture and nutrients for the first 3 years of a new tree planting, especially when small 2-year-old seedlings are used for planting stock. Cultivation, organic mulch, weed barrier fabric, and herbicides are some of the most common methods used to control weeds and grass. A 3 to 4 foot radius around each tree should be kept free from weed and grass competition. A single application of a pre-emergent herbicide over the top of a tree row in a 4 foot wide band can control weeds and grass for up to 6 to 8 months. Ideally, pre-emergent application should be made in March before weed and grass seeds begin to germinate. However, they can still be applied if combined with a post-herbicide product like glyphosate to kill existing vegetation. Pendulum is one of the more popular pre-emergent herbicides used on tree plantings in Kansas. Post-emergent herbicides can be sprayed over the top of tree rows, and trees must be protected during applications. Weed barrier fabric is a plastic mulch that comes in large 6 foot wide rolls or in 4x4 squares. After planting, fabric is placed over the top of the trees. A slit is cut in the center and the trees are pulled through. Weed barrier fabric allows water to move through and suppress competing vegetation. It is tough enough to withstand deer and lasts much longer than is actually needed. In fact, in some cases, the fabric should be removed to avoid girdling trees as they age. Whatever weed and grass control method you choose for your tree planting, make sure to keep it up for the first 3 years after planting. Weed and grass control is more important than supplemental watering. Vegetative ground covers that do not compete with tree growth should also be used. This may vary from buffalo grass in the western part of Kansas to clovers in the east. Fescue and brome should never be used for ground covers and tree plantings. This is Bob Atchison with the Kansas Forest Service, and you've been listening to another Tree Tale.
Many thanks, Bob. Jeff Wickman checks in with this week's 4-H segment. That's next, here on Agriculture Today. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today, 800-321-3276, or visit us online, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. I'm Jeff Wickman. Kansas is famous for its wheat fields stretching across the state. And for decades, Kansas 4-H has been offering families a chance to participate in an educational experience built around all things wheat, from cleaning it to baking with it. This year's Kansas 4-H State Wheat Expo is being held August 2nd at the Community Center in South Hutchinson. Northwest Area 4-H Specialist Deryl Waldren says this annual event has been going on for more than 60 years.
That is correct. The Kansas 4-H Wheat Expo has had a few different names through the decades, but we now call it the Kansas 4-H Wheat Expo, which is a all things wheat field day for 4-H members, family members, project leaders, extension staff, pretty much anybody who would like to come to it.
It is on August 2nd, and it will be in South Hutchinson. Tell me what goes on.
Well, we have a variety of activities. There'll be some judging activities for the kids to practice with, and they'll get to judge things like different kernels of wheat from 4 different varieties of wheat and figure out which is the best wheat. There'll be a photo judging class, a breads or a muffin class, and probably a weeds identification class. And these are mostly for fun, but we do go over the results so they can learn from the different things. There'll be a choice of 2 different tours, and we'll have lunch, and There are exhibits that they bring in that day. They'll bring in a variety of exhibits, which I can explain in a little bit, and they'll be judged and ribbons put on them, and then an explanation as to what occurred in those different classes. And a few door prizes, and we wrap it up in about 6 hours.
You have 9 different divisions for the youth to participate in?
Yes. The first 2, they have to actually submit a sample of wheat by July 20th to Manhattan for testing. And that could be for those, we call it Division 1, or for those that are enrolled in a crops project. And then a Division 2 is called Adopt a Producer, and that could be a grandparent, an uncle, a friend, a neighbor down the road, and they can actually submit a sample of wheat from their field and learn about the process of all the milling and baking qualities that wheat has. Those have to be submitted earlier. Divisions 3 through 9 are actually brought the day of the event on August 2nd. Class number 3 is what we call cleaning a quart jar of wheat. And they take a quart jar of wheat and they clean it, and it's judged on those qualities of being clean, free from weeds, other foreign matter, broken kernels, that kind of stuff. They can have 3 yeast rolls in Division 4. Division 5 is 3 cookies. Division 6 is 3 muffins. We have a wheat photo contest where they'll bring in their photos that are related to wheat. Division 8 is a educational poster display contest, and 9 is for clover buds, and that's for 5 and 6-year-olds that they can participate and get a participatory ribbon.
This is definitely an educational experience, then.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's a high quality educational wheat field day, and it's built in with a lot of fun. The 2 tours, they have to pick the choice of tours this year. Both of the tours have a double thing that they'll see. So the first one is Dillon's Nature Center in Hutch, as well as Kaufman Seeds Incorporated, which is also in Hutch. The second tour would be Hedrick's Exotic Animal Farm up in Nickerson, or the Kincaid Seed Research and Wheat Plots down in Yoder. So they'll pick one or the other when they register online on the 4-H CVent system.
And what happens during those tours? They get kind of a hands-on experience?
Yeah, they're varied based on the local location, and I work with Joan Crummy, who's the 4-H youth development agent in Reno County, and she worked to get these set up with the ag agent Darren Busick, and we just go with the flow with whatever's in that local venue. So this year we have a great variety of tours, and yeah, they're designed to be hopefully some related to agriculture and wheat, but as you know, the Dillon's Nature Center isn't, but it's a wonderful resource in that community, so we try to share whatever's local also.
In terms of the things that are baked goods, you've got the cookies, the muffins, and the yeast rolls. Those are things that should be prepared ahead of time.
They have to be prepared, within that day or the day before, probably the day before, and they bring in that day because other than the first 2 divisions where they have to submit the wheat to be tested, all the other exhibits are brought the day of the event on August 2nd. And there is a $6 cost for the CVent registration cost. But other than that, everything else is covered.
What are some other things that they take away from taking part in this?
Well, I mean, they bring in their exhibits. They're judged. We have the judges then explain how they selected different, the different ribbons as to why things are what they saw and overall for that particular division's exhibit. So, it might be on the quart sample jar of wheat that there was a lot of weed seeds or there were broken kernels, and they talk about the need for uniformity in all. When you sort wheat to make it a quart jar, we make it simple because at the state fair it's a gallon jar, that you have to have uniformity. You want like color, like size, nice plump berries, and when you have other stuff in it, that degrades the quality of that exhibit. So each of the divisions would have the judge explain what they were looking for and why those exhibits did or did not make that level of quality. And so the tours are also educational. We have these fun judging classes, so there's just a lot of education but also a lot of fun going on at the same time.
In terms of getting things submitted, how do they go about that process?
The easiest would be to go to our Kansas 4-H website, www.kansas4-h.org. Again, that's www.kansas4-h.org. Under the What's Hot on the homepage, click on the Wheat Expo, and it'll take them to that registration page, and then they'll fill it out and follow the prompts, and they can get registered. And every member who's coming does have to register.
And this is families and 4-H members?
Families, grandparents, volunteer leaders, extension staff, anybody, somebody was visiting on vacation, bring them along. We have a great time that day.
Anything else?
Yeah, my contact information would be Deryl Waldren at 6281, and my email is dwaldren@ksu.edu, DWALDREN@ksu.edu. We hope to see a great number of people who come to South Hutch on August 2nd for the Kansas 4-H Wheat Expo.
It does sound like a lot of fun, and this is something that does have a registration deadline. You need people to register by July 22nd.
Right, and we say 11:59 p.m. that night because it's all digital, electronic. There may be an extension if we are close, but, most people register by July 22nd.
That's Northwest Area 4-H Specialist Deryl Waldren. Again, for more information about the Kansas 4-H State Wheat Expo being held August 2nd at the Community Center in South Hutchinson, visit kansas4h.org. And this reminder, if you'd like to listen to the podcast version of Agriculture Today, visit agtoday.net, or using an app on your mobile device, type these search keywords, Agriculture, Today, Kansas, and you'll find this program. By tapping the subscribe button, brand new episodes of Agriculture Today will automatically arrive on your device. That's agtoday.net. This is the K-State Radio Network.